Hello, everyone, and welcome to our new show entitled Our Voices, an exciting Muslimah Montage, AltMontage live panel discussion. Our Voices will be aired bi-monthly, which is every 2 months. We'll be discussing cultural, religious, and societal issues and more pertaining to Muslims, specifically Muslim women and their very distinct voices, stories, and journeys as told by them. I'm Naisha Malika B. Austin, writer and mentor, and I'll be your host today. Our topic is Muslim women writers and their writing and publishing experiences. We have questions posed from other writers via social media that we will be asking our guests today. But before we jump in with the questions and comments, allow me to introduce our amazing panelists. Up first, joining us from Chicago is Fariba Nawa. Fariba Nawa is an award-winning Afghan-American journalist. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, Sunday Times of London, Foreign Affairs, The Daily Beast, Newsday, Mother Jones, The Village Voice, The Christian Science Monitor, San Francisco Chronicles, and numerous other publications. She also reports for radio, including NPR. Her own book, Opium Nation, Child Brides, Jugglers, and Other Women's Journeys Through Afghanistan, is a mixed memoir and reportage of the drug trade in Afghanistan. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm in San Francisco, by the way.
Next, we have Zareen Jaffrey. Welcome to the panel.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Zareen Jaffrey is the executive editor at Simon & Schuster Books for Young Readers. She acquires commercial and literary young adult and middle grade fiction, as well as teen nonfiction. Prior to working in children's publishing, she was an editor of fiction and nonfiction in Hyperion, the book publishing arm of the Walt Disney Company. Zareen, thank you so much for joining us today. Our third guest is Salima Abdul Ghafoor. Salima is the director of the African Leaders Malaria Alliance and is the recipient of the United for Change Excellence in Human Service Award. She edited the seminal anthology Living Islam Out Loud, American Muslim Women Speak, and is a published expert on Muslim women in the West. Salima is a graduate of Columbia University. We're so honored to have you here with us today. Thank you so much, ladies, for being here. Okay, so our first question that we have right now it's pretty much for anyone to talk about. We want to know a little bit about your publishing journey, specifically in regards to the first book that you wrote or that you edited. How did you start off? Zareen, can I start with you?
Sure. I was a journalism major in college and was very much interested in not having to decide what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And journalism gave me an opportunity to focus on a lot of different topics and interview a lot of different people. And when I graduated, I actually became more interested in books than newspapers and magazines. So I ended up applying to a job as an editorial assistant at a women's fiction company. And not knowing anyone in the industry, honestly, and I feel very lucky that I was able to get that job and started an apprenticeship from there. Book publishing is absolutely an apprenticeship industry in the editorial side, and everything that I've learned from the editors that I've worked for and the writers that I've worked with.
It's pretty amazing. Anyone else want to tell us about their journey? How did you start out?
I think I'm older than a lot of people here. I'm not sure, but I'm 42, and I started writing when I was in high school. And my first article was published in the San Jose Mercury News during the first Gulf War, and it was because myself and other Muslim classmates were being taunted and made fun of, and I felt the need to write something about who we were. And I don't look the Muslim part that people, when they immediately look at me, they don't know that I'm Muslim or not, because there's a specific stereotype of what being Muslim is. And I felt like I had to write this, and then it was widely published through a newswire. So that's how I knew that I wanted to keep doing this. And I think I was 16, 17 at the time. And that's how it all started. And then I went to college and I studied liberal arts in Massachusetts, and then on to grad school at NYU with journalism. But I've been writing ever since, and it's mostly been journalism. That's my passion, and nonfiction is where my focus is.
That's great, thank you. Salima, can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Sure. Let me first say assalamu alaikum and thank you for inviting me to this Google chat, and thank you so much. It's honored to be here with the other guests as well. I should say that I'm probably, well, one, I'm 40, about to be 41, so you're not the oldest, well, you're technically the oldest, but we are in good company, Fariba. So let me say that I'm probably the non-traditional writer here. I did not grow up and say I wanted to be a writer, always was a prolific reader, and really at my core, I'm an activist. And what essentially happened with me is I was working for various publications and doing some largely online blogging, and got picked. There was a story done on me in the Boston Globe, and the publishing house called and said, well, you know, would you like to talk about Muslim women? And I was like, well, I don't have time for that. And it was actually Beacon Press in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I said, I don't have time. I was very busy. I was working a lot. And like 6 months later, I mentioned it to a friend of mine who was an author and an editor, and she said, "Are you crazy? You go back." And I went back, and I was like, "Well, if I do something, I want to do it on kick-ass Muslim women." That's exactly what I said. I want to do a story on kick-ass Muslim women in America, because when I was born and raised Muslim, grew up as a Muslim, and I didn't see enough images of women who were like me. Women who were born and raised in America as Muslims. Most of what I saw growing up was the immigrant story or the conversion story. And so I said, there's this whole second generation of women who have created this identity and who live this identity, and I would like to hear more from them. Mm-hmm. So I pitched that almost exactly that way, and they said, write it up, we love it. And that is how I got into writing. So I really am grateful to be in this group and have tremendous respect for those whose full-time career is to write. But I will say that it came to me as one of many platforms that I've used to express myself.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Okay, our second question is, writers have often asked about struggles that maybe you've had in your publishing journey. Did you all ever have any periods of writer's block, and how did you overcome them?
I'll go. I'm going through writer's block right now. If anybody wants to help me unlock it. I'm working on my second book. It's my first book was called Opium Nation, and it was a reporting journey, really. It was about doing what I love to do, which is go into the field and do investigative reporting, but also talk about my own journey back home, which is Afghanistan, going back after 18 years, and sort of getting to know my country again. And so it was 2 books in one that I wrote, and it took 7 years to write it. It was not an easy journey, but it was one I learned a lot from. And I thought, okay, the second book's going to be easier, but it hasn't been, because I'm trying something very different. I'm trying something more literary. It's another memoir, but it's focused on this community here. Many of you know about Afghanistan, right, through the media, but how many of you know that there are 300,000 Afghans, at least, in the U.S., and who we are? Again, similar to what she was saying, that very few people understand these communities outside of the sort of the stereotypical images that we see in the media. And so I was interested in writing about this, but it's been difficult because I miss news. So I'm going back and forth between, there's so much happening in the Muslim world right now that I'm like, do I have the luxury of sitting here and writing about myself in this community, which happens to be fairly peaceful, instead of actually focusing on what's going on in the Middle East and Europe and everywhere else? So I get pulled back and forth. So I'm doing both things at once, and I seem to be a lot more prolific at journalism writing and quicker stories. With books, it takes a lot longer, and you have to be a lot more patient. So yeah, I'm going to go back to the book eventually, but it's something that has been lingering for a couple of years now.
Okay. Anyone else ever have writer's block? Or
you know, I can speak to it as an editor mostly. I've also written, but I have much more experience as an editor trying to talk to my authors about their experiences with writer's block and trying to coach them through it. And every writer is very different. I will say the one consistent thing that helps every writer I know, one, it's my putting a deadline on it. Like, absolutely having to have a book in on a certain schedule definitely makes a difference. And also this this idea that you have to wait for inspiration is so misguided, and the reason I say that is that writing isn't always going to be fun. It's not always going to be something that you do and you feel so smart, and it's a catharsis, and sometimes it's painful, but growth comes through pain, and it doesn't matter if you're writing fiction or nonfiction. I think that that's true, and the routine of it is what leads to inspiration. This is one of the things that I try to tell my writers. I'm like, you write every day. You have to write every day, even if it's a page. And one of those days, you're going to hit on an idea that's going to spark your interest and your love for what you're writing again. Because at the end of the day, it's all about emotions and relationships too. So, and I think the other piece of it is, and this is entirely speculation on my point, but especially for the writers that I've worked with who've never published before, we live in a world that gives us a lot of instant gratification, and writing a book is the exact opposite of instant gratification. And there's so many different distractions that will feed that need for you, whether it's Twitter or TV, as a form of sort of numbing yourself from doing the work that will give you so much more fulfillment. So recognizing the things that you do to get away from the important work is also a good way to guide you back to the right path, your writing path, if that's helpful.
Okay. It is. Thank you. Waiting for inspiration is a waste of time.
That's true. Salima, you text
I was actually listening because I think it's great to have an editor weigh in on it and provide support. As I said, being the sort of non-traditional writer here, I have not experienced writer's block primarily because I don't write full time. When I do write, it's because I have a specific assignment that I've taken on because I have the time and the space, and I'm really excited about the idea. What I have more of a challenge with is discipline, not waiting until the last minute to get the pen on the, well, not the pen on the paper, but the finger to the keyboard.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's not so much writer's block, it's just the discipline. And I think what she said about writing a page every day is so important. I always say to myself, every single day I have to work on this. I either have to index, do it on, I'm old-fashioned, I guess, because I'm older. I do stuff on index cards, I journal, and then I highlight before I actually get to putting it on paper. So I think each person is different, but it's still one of those things where it's 4 o'clock in the morning and I may only have 2 sentences down.
I feel you.
I understand that. I actually have reminders on my phone that says you need to finish a short story per day for a 6-word memoir or something like that. I actually have reminders for myself.
Yeah, that's exactly. And actually, I have family and friends who are supportive too. My mom will text me. My mom texts me every morning some, inspirational something and that she's created, and she'll say, just do something today. Just do something today on that piece.
That's great. I totally understand that. Okay, and the last question that we have, what do you wish that you were actually told before you went into the literary and publishing industry? I mean, sometimes you get pushed out into it and then you're not given all of the advice that you need. What do you wish you were told?
There's such a learning curve when you go from daily writing or journalism to book writing. It's really a different world, and I think Zarian could attest to that. I had no idea what beast marketing could be. And much of it is really on you. A big publisher like HarperCollins published my book, but I was, and the publicist helped me where she could, but really you're on your own with a lot of these contacts, getting in touch. So being in the media helps because you have the media contacts to put your book out there. And then social media was something new to me, and I had to learn it. I really fought against Twitter, and I very old school that way, but I've learned to navigate slowly and figure out how to market my book. But I think, for example, the title of my book was a real big fight. I did not want Opium Nation as the title of my book. I wanted it to be Where the Poppies Bloom. And I was told that no. The reason why is because that is going to, it's too soft. We need something harder. We need a male audience for this book as well as a female audience. And you know, we went back and forth several times, and I finally gave in to this because I thought, I want people to read this. So if the title is going to be catchy and they're going to pick it up, for me what's important is that they read inside these pages and understand what I'm talking about. But I got a lot of criticism from my own community. And the way they saw it was, how dare you, one of us, put a negative spin on Afghanistan when everyone else is doing the same thing? How could you call our entire country an opium nation? And there were people who would boycott my talks, because I've done a lot of talks across the country in universities and libraries and writers groups who were Afghan. They said, no, I'm not coming to this, without even picking it up because of the title. So I don't think HarperCollins realized how much this title could hurt me personally. And so that was a lesson for me to learn. And then beside that, how hard it is to write something so long. And it's just a lot of patience for journalists, because we do want instant gratification the next day.
Okay, thank you so much. Doreen, are you able to take that question?
Sure. So, did you say my name? Sorry.
Yes, Doreen. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. I would say creating a community of writers is incredibly important for a number of reasons. One, for things like writer's block, having other people who are going through the same thing to be your support system is huge if you're able to have that. It doesn't have to be in person. I think that it's sometimes very difficult in our very busy lives to make, like, oh, let me go 2 hours and go to a writing group. I don't think that's feasible for many people who want to write. Having someone who's like an online reading, beta reader is what a lot of writers call it, people who read your work before it goes to someone who's like, a professional, a literary agent, or an editor. And it gives you an opportunity to not feel so alone in the process. And then when your book actually comes out, you have this group of people who is supportive of you. In my experience, when I was an editorial assistant, I co-wrote a children's book, which taught me a lot about the process of being an editor, honestly, because I saw the experience from the other side, and you do feel very alone. And even though I was already in the industry, there were so many things that I did not understand about the process. I didn't understand about how it felt to be a writer, emailing your editor and asking them these questions and feeling, this might be entirely my own personality, but I have heard this from some of my other writers, feeling bad about bothering them when these are things that are so important to you because you're trying to do your best by a book that you've spent a lot of time on. And understanding that level of uncertainty is really helpful to me, because I now know how important communication is. And I think that having a relationship with the people who you work with in creative endeavors and in any endeavor, feeling comfortable enough to ask them questions is huge. And I realize now that it's not always a given. And in the creative process, too, you want someone who will point out some of the concerns they have with your work, but also be very excited for you when things are going well. You want that balance, and you want someone who you can sort of debate different ideas with, whether it's marketing ideas. I've had to tell authors, like, I think it's great that you're willing to spend money towards the marketing of your book, but the way that you want to spend it is not the smart way to do it, and that can be hard to hear too, because you want to feel a little bit more in control. Marketing is so tough. It's tough when you're inside the publishing house. It's tough when you're a writer too, and part of it is because no one knows what will really work. We live in an age when, and I work predominantly on teen books, so it's really hard to market to teens because what they're interested in seems to change so frequently. But creating a community, I think, so you can talk about all of these issues, brainstorm different things that have been successful for you, and also be supportive throughout the creative process is huge. I would say that's my biggest piece of advice that I wish I had known.
Yeah. Salima.
Yeah, the thread that I would pick up on is I just, as I keep saying, I'm the non-traditional writer here, but what I think is so important is that more and more Muslim women tell their stories. You know, the Beacon Press published my book in 2005, and there is still a need today to have a greater diversity of American Muslim women telling their own stories. We are not a monolithic group. We are extraordinarily diverse, and we have extraordinary stories to contribute to the fabric of humankind. And so anytime I think a Muslim woman has the opportunity to contribute her voice to or her writings, whatever platform she chooses, I think she should do that. And that is what I find incredibly inspiring and authentic and ultimately earth-changing, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. I do have a few more questions for you all, actually. The next question I have is just for anyone that can take it, but when did you know writing and or editing was your passion? Like, I know Oprah talks about that aha moment. When did you actually know that this is what you were passionate about?
I mean, I would explain writing to voice. Oh, go ahead, Fariba.
No, go ahead, Salima. You go ahead.
I would just say that I always knew. I mean, I was always talking. I was always writing. I was always taking pictures. I was always expressing myself. We were encouraged to do that in my household. My parents were very much nurturing and supportive and promoted us speaking and having our voice heard and being articulate when we expressed that. So, and every educational environment that I was in fostered that, that individual sense of affirming my individual self, even though I was in many ways and still am very different from the people in my community. So I think that self-acceptance was part of it, but also just the I've always known that I was that way. So I guess when the idea came along to write the book, it just seemed like a natural progression or a natural next step for me. And many of the people that we convened to do the anthology were and are still traditional writers, in the sense that they're novelists, they're journalists, they're authors, and they're award-winning. And we sort of talked about the differences among us, but all of us knew at a very young age that we wanted to have our voice heard in the world.
It's very important. Fariba or Zareen, you all want to take that question? When did you actually?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I knew very early on. I come from a family of writers, and they wrote in Farsi in Afghanistan. My grandfather, my father, and a lot of them were political writers. My grandfather was a women's rights activist. So for me, writing became a tool of expression. As Zareen said, it's very cathartic, but it's also became a tool to be an activist. And so not a lot of my English teacher, I didn't speak a word of English until I was 10 years old when I came to this country. But by 12, I was fluent, and my English teacher said, well, you have a voice, why don't you continue writing? And I thought, well, I'm not really interested in fiction. I love to read fiction, but there's more out there. And then journalism became the right choice. And so I knew very early on this is what I wanted to do. It was kind of a calling, I suppose.
Thank you. Zareen?
Yeah, for me, I've developed this sort of mythic story of how I became so interested in words, just in hindsight. But when I was a kid, I remember so clearly the only book that my parents brought with them from Pakistan was the Quran. And they moved to the United States 2 years before I was born. And we didn't have books in my house. We went to the library for books, and I always thought of books as this amazing sort of magical thing where my mother had her Quran in this beautiful satin cover that my grandmother had made for her. Apologies if I get a little emotional. My grandmother just passed away. So seeing her with that book and the reverence that she placed on those words felt so important to me. So I always treated books with that reverence too, and definitely when I was able to get my library card and actually get books out of the library, I took that very seriously. I felt very adult and important. So stories have always been such an important part of my life. And now that I'm older and I've always felt very lucky to make my living in a creative field. I see how rare that is, and that's changed in some ways recently, mostly because when I moved into children's publishing, the thing that I understood on a visceral level but didn't really interact with in my job was this need for more diverse stories for children. You know, as a kid growing up in the United States, I didn't have any representations of me in any of the stories I read, and the closest I got, interestingly, was this book, and it's a beautiful book, and I'm not saying that it's not a beautiful book, but it was this book called Shabanu, Daughter of the Wind, and it was about a Pakistani girl who was in Pakistan, and I did not, like, I avoided that book like as if it had some sort of disease, because I did not want to be associated with a character who was not American. You know, I felt very American. I was born and raised here. I was interacting, I was going to school, and my goal back then as a kid, as a very sort of misguided kid, was to not make myself seem very different. You know, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and I definitely would prefer children to embrace their backgrounds, whether it's whether they're first generation or not. We all have a history, and it's important not to want to erase that history or feel burdened by it, but to celebrate it. And one of the ways and to celebrate it in others too, and the people that we interact with as kids. So with that conversation, and now with the role that I have where I work, there's definitely a deeper meaning to what I can do to help make that more of a reality. And certainly racism exists in this world, and that is something that we have to face regardless of what industry we're in. And I don't mean in a personal way, I mean in terms of like the books that sell well versus the books that don't. It's tough sometimes, but having the conversation is the first part of addressing the issue. So yeah, I'm sorry, I gave sort of a meandering answer, but
Okay, another question I have you all dealt with any sexism or opposition in a heavily male-dominated industry? I know that there are a lot of women within the media and literary industry, but I still know it's still sort of dominated by males. Have you dealt with any of that?
Well, I just want to say that, well, first I want to just give my condolences to the loss of your grandmother. I had two wonderful grandmothers, and, you know, surely they are, you know, the antidote for everything. And I just, when you had your memories, I just remember, like, you know, I would like sidle up to my grandmother and put my head on her shoulder, and all would be well. So thank you for the memory, for invoking that. But in terms of when Living Islam Out Loud came out, I didn't feel as though I'd experienced rejection or discrimination from men. I did experience some backlash in the Muslim community because I included a Muslim woman who was a lesbian in the book, and I felt I did that because I thought it was important to have an open and honest conversation about sexuality in the Muslim community. You know, the entire book is a collection of stories, but it's all about women talking about, you know, not so much their degrees and sort of their professional accomplishments, but the really personal and intimate things that connect us in the human family. And some of those things are uncomfortable for quote unquote mainstream Muslims. Mm-hmm. So there was a backlash around her, and also just having women talk about their husbands, talk about racism in the Muslim community, talking about how they felt isolated or how they felt mistreated by people who were not Muslim, but also by people who were Muslim. And so I did get a bit of you're airing our dirty laundry in public, and I said to deny us the right to these stories is to deny our humanity. You cannot tell a woman that her story is not right or not valid. It just is, right? So I think, and part of what the book did is it really, in a huge way, began this conversation around gender roles in the American Muslim community. So where women have space and voice in the mosque, how they participate in community life, how they can participate in spiritual life, the role that they have in their domestic scene, not just in their nuclear family, but in their larger family. And there were Muslims, men and women, who were uncomfortable with that conversation. The point of the book was not to say it should be one way over the other, or one thing is approved over the other. The point was to say this is what Muslims look like. There is no one way. There are many ways, and some people were uncomfortable with that, and some people still are uncomfortable with that. But I don't in any way regret those decisions.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Fariba or Zareen?
Yeah, a little bit of technical difficulty on my side. I don't know if you guys are getting the, but I deal with discrimination on a daily basis from men, and I think many people who have been part of Muslimah Montage can relate to it, and it comes mostly from our own community, whether that be Afghan, Pakistani, Indian Muslims, Arabs, whatever. But there's definitely this sense that if you are not covered, if you're not going the traditional route, then there's something wrong with you. You're not Muslim enough. And if you're speaking out, well, that's just American. This constant delegitimization that because I don't look the part, again, I'm naturally blonde, that's just not Muslim enough. And it's not necessarily from the Western community. That's a different kind of discrimination altogether, and we can talk about that. But it comes from within. And it's this delegitimization of, you're a Western feminist. What are you talking about? How dare you talk about our women? And I'm very vocal. And I've become vocal in the last few years that I've lived in the U.S. Because when I was living in Afghanistan, I was living in Pakistan as a journalist, I had to be very careful. Because it can risk your life. And I've known women who have, in Afghanistan, who've lost their lives as a result of speaking out. But I feel safe enough to do so from here. And within my own community, this is not just, we're not talking about these issues in Nigeria or in the Middle East or in South Asia. We're talking about these communities right here and the kinds of things that are happening right here. And we're talking about sex trafficking, domestic violence. Where I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, in Fremont, the police department will call me and say, we are having a huge problem with domestic violence in the Muslim community. What do we do about it? The numbers are overwhelming. And we can talk about that in so many different ways, but now I'm on social media and I'm loud about the things that I think are wrong, and of course that's going to get pushed back. And often it's from women. Often it's from women as well. Sometimes women are each other's worst enemies. I've come to understand that in a really sad way.
Okay, thank you so much for your input. Anyone else? Zareen?
Sorry, the landscapers decide to show up right now, so I hope there's not a lot of interference in the background. Can you hear them?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. I have not experienced sexism in my profession, thankfully. Actually, in book publishing, it's predominantly women, so that probably has a part to play there. Racism, I haven't been the direct victim of it within my industry, but certainly there have been moments where, as recently as probably 5 years ago, I was in a room and someone said, not where I work right now, let me make that clear, and someone said no one wants to read, this was about children's books, no one wants to read a story about a Muslim family. And I remember sitting in that room and thinking, what world do we live in where that is something that can be so casually said in a professional environment? I was just shocked. It's sort of an indication of where we are as a society, and certainly, this week has been really tough because, Islamophobia has been pretty strong this week in terms of the kinds of things people are saying, and I absolutely feel an obligation and a responsibility to try to help people from different communities that have voices but are not given a platform to speak, to try to help them get out there. It's so important. And I have the luxury of living a life that is very safe. You know, I went for Hajj this past fall with my mother, and seeing, it was a very moving experience, and seeing in a very, like, sometimes you just need that push to see how privileged you are and what you can really, but we're part of a larger humanity, of not just Muslims, but just of people. And it really is, it's a gift that you can give other people when you open their mind to different ways of thinking, and showing that we are all facing the same struggles. We may call them different things, but we all are facing the same struggles. And, you know, I don't agree with erasing anyone's experiences, even when it comes to people who have had issues with Muslims. You know, I recently, in the past 2 years, edited a book by a woman who is Egyptian by birth, and her parents actually sold her into domestic slavery when she was very young. And she wrote a memoir about her experience. She was actually not kidnapped, but essentially kidnapped. They smuggled her into the U.S., this family that bought her, and she was a maid for them in Orange County, California, one of the richest places in this country, living in a room off their garage. And her experiences were terrible. She's not a believer. She's not a Muslim. And, you know, I was very cognizant of the possibility that people would be upset with me for giving her a book deal, because she was showing the Muslim people in a bad light. And isn't there enough of that already? Mm-hmm. Yes, there is, but that doesn't mean you silence the people who are most vulnerable. That doesn't mean you give a pass to the people who are behaving in immoral ways. Because, yeah, Muslims are not a monolith. There are good and bad among any people, and to protect the bad ones is to do a disservice to Islam, I think. So that's sort of where I stand on that.
Thank you. Those are really great points. I really appreciate that. So speaking of opposition, have you all ever faced any rejection in the literary world? Like, have any publishers ever just flat out said, no, we're not accepting this, or, you know, come back later or something about your manuscripts?
I mean, I'm on the publisher end, so you know,
Can I send you my next book?
I can, you know, recommend some great nonfiction editors for adult. I wish I could publish your book. It sounds awesome.
No, it's my own doing. My proposal is in process. The problem is, as a nonfiction writer, the process is very different. And I get a lot of people coming to me and say, oh, you wrote a book. What can we do? What they don't understand is, with fiction and nonfiction, there's a whole different process. With nonfiction, you're writing the actual book, you're writing the manuscript, you're having it read, you're almost perfecting it before you submit it to the publishers. And then the editors, and I think Zareen can add on to this if you want, and then the editors will decide whether they want to take it or not. And so you've already written the book as a fiction writer. With nonfiction, you're writing the proposal. You're writing a summary of the book, and you're working for free the whole time. And you don't even know if this is going to get sold. But you can't write the whole book because it's almost like a waste of time. And what I've been told is that you don't write the whole book as a nonfiction writer. They're not going to read it. The proposal is what they want to look at. And they want to see if it's marketable, and they want to see if it's something that they want to write. I mean, I started out with this second book as an idea, and it has transformed because I'm getting to know myself as a writer. It's kind of working that different side of my brain. I've always written other people's stories. I've written in journalistic form, and now I want to do something more literary where I can talk about, use flowery words. And I don't even know if I'm very good at that. So I'm getting to know myself and practicing as I do it, and I need to be more disciplined about it. Zareen's words that, you know, you don't really, inspiration comes when you start writing. It's not about that. What inspires me, I think, and I need to get out there and do this more, is nature. I was thinking of just depugging, especially from social media. That's just a real hindrance to creativity, I feel like. And going out, and, you know, our laptops have, what, 3-4 hours of battery on it. Going out and sitting on a bench where I normally go hiking and writing. I think that's going to help me a lot. I haven't been able to do that yet. And that might actually get this proposal done and submit it. But as far as rejection is concerned, as a freelancer, I submit stories all the time. They get rejected from magazines. There's a specific type of, and you both can actually talk about this. I'm curious to know your opinions. there's a certain type of narrative they want from Muslim women, the publishing industry, whether that's the media or whether it's publications. And it's often this woman who's struggling against her society, who's trying to become more westernized. This is the narrative that they seem to really love. And if it's anything different, I was approached to write a book about a young girl who wants to marry outside the community and she refuses, a fiction book, or go find something to that extent in nonfiction. And I refused to write it because I'm like, wait, you're just pushing the stereotype. If I find a story like that, I come across it and it's a great story and it naturally sort of is part of my reporting, then I will write it. But I'm not going to go look for it because that's what you're looking for. And that's kind of been, again, I'm being told that my last article I did was called "My Family and Other Extremists" in Newsweek. And with the problem again was the headline. We don't choose the headlines as writers, and we often don't choose titles as well. I'm curious to know from Zareen, how often do writers get to choose their own titles in books? Because I have problems.
Before we get into that, I also want to make sure that I know Zareen is on a time schedule, right? And
yeah, I'm happy to answer this question. I do have to go in probably about 10 minutes.
That as well.
For nonfiction, actually, it's really tough, and I've certainly had experiences where authors did not love their title. I mean, as publishers, what we say is the jacket, everything that, like the image on the cover, the title, and the flap copy, that's advertising. You know, that's our moment to get as many readers as possible interested in buying your book. And I can see in those cases where the opinions and the feelings of a smaller community, whether it's like the Pakistan-American community or the Afghan-American community or, you know, what have you, are not really taken into account because there's no way for publishers to know how big those communities are and what they can do for a book if they really get behind it. Because it's sort of this chicken and egg situation where, you know, you have a book that maybe would appeal to a community and could get people really behind it and start this word of mouth, but because they have no examples of that having worked in the past, they're really hesitant to try it now. And that's, again, I think, you know, my personal opinion is that goes back to sort of the racism that is just true in society right now. It's sort of, there's only ever been a certain type of person who's been the decision maker, the gatekeeper in the industry, and even if they are well-meaning, they don't have the same need to tell these sorts of stories. They don't get the importance of it necessarily, or they don't relate to it in the same way, so they might not be as willing to take that risk. Because again, you know, publishing is a business like anything else, and at the end of the day, we have to convince the money people that we should spend money on something. And it's very tricky. I do think, you know, a lot of what Muslimah and Fariba have said about the community being sometimes our own worst enemy, I have heard that before, and it's very troubling and sad, and I think that more and more people being willing to speak out and for people to see that actually it's a good thing, to humanize us is a good thing, might help change that.
Okay. Thank you. I know Salima also has to leave soon. Do you have any closing remarks or any advice for us?
No, I would just want to say again, thank you for having me on this chat. And really, I'm an activist at heart, and so I believe that what I want to see, what the world needs more of, is Muslim women to tell their own stories on blogs, in books, on social media, in every way possible. It's, I think, what has the publishing world stop looking for the trite and, you know, sensationalized, unauthentic stories, is having Muslim women tell the truth about their lives and experiences. I think it's incredibly empowering for us and for the world. So I would just encourage all of you to continue to tell your stories, and please, you know, stay in touch if there's anything I can do to be helpful. And thank you so much for having me be a part of this forum.
No problem. Thank you. All right, and so I guess that leaves us with Fariba. What is a question that you're often asked by aspiring writers, and how do you respond?
Aspiring writers?
Mm-hmm.
What is the question that I'm often asked? How do we get published? almost every writer circle that I've done. And part of what I do is talking. I'm a speaker, so I go across the country talking about various issues. And the questions, one thing that is really heartening and that I love about Americans is that they're still very curious. And there's different kind of racism in Europe and here. And I reported in both places extensively. And in Europe, they know Muslims. They've had a long history with Muslims. A friend and I were talking about this, and he made a really great point about post-September 11 and post-Charlie Hebdo. And he said, I'm probably going on a tangent here, but I'll come back to the aspiring writers. He said that here in Europe, the discrimination is about knowing us and not liking us. And that, they are anti-Muslim. In America, it's just sheer ignorance. That's why after September 11, they were killing Sikhs instead of actual Muslims, because they were mad. Mm-hmm. There isn't the kind of connection information, and we don't have the numbers in terms of population with the American community. But that actually, in a way, that leaves us room to educate. That leaves us room to get out there and be more active and sort of teach them about this diversity and ways of thinking. And people are interested in writing their own stories, but they don't realize how hard it is, especially in terms of publishing. Social media has given great access to these different voices, and that's wonderful, but that comes with a responsibility, and a lot of these new writers don't understand the importance of accuracy. I mean, it's one thing that I keep pushing, especially nonfiction, is you have to back up what you're talking about. I get a lot of conspiracy theorists wanting to write their perspectives, and when it's not true, then turn it into fiction. Nonfiction basically means no fabrication, no exaggeration, no composites, unless the composites are necessary to ensure safety of someone's identity if they're being threatened. But really, I'm really sort of old school on nonfiction being nonfiction completely. And a lot of younger people who are in doing this kind of work don't really understand that. And they could just say whatever they want on Twitter, and to them that's fact. So, yeah, mostly people want to get published.
Okay. Zareen, I see you're still with us. Do you have any final remarks or advice?
Just to echo what Salima said, I would love to see more Muslims writing. I understand that there are so many challenges, certainly, and I've absolutely faced a lot of those challenges myself. Finding the time to do it is about making the time to do it, and getting over the fear that people in your family and the community, which is a very real fear. That's our real life. That's the place that we live and interact. Being worried about how they'll perceive us when we write the truth. I certainly, and I can only speak from my own personal experience, but I certainly come from a community that sometimes prefers to put a pretty picture on things as opposed to really addressing some of the terrible things that happen in life, and it can make people feel very alone. And I don't have kids, but I have nephews and nieces, and I am very cognizant of the world that they're growing up in as young Muslims. And certainly there are challenges, and I don't want them to ever feel the loneliness I felt growing up and not feeling like a part of a larger community. And a really important part of that is hearing other people's stories. We will not have the same stories. I think that's the other thing. As an editor, I do receive a lot of submissions, and certainly growing up, I was guilty of this too, absolutely. But this narrative that centers itself on a very white middle-class experience where the story is really about how they feel different. And that is a very true story, but it's also one that has been heard so many times. I read this really great interview with the author of An Unnecessary Woman, which was shortlisted for the National Book Award, I think, this year, where someone had asked him in a very Western-centric way, like, how did you write this story about a woman in Lebanon? And you made it so, I think it's either Lebanon or Libya, I haven't read the book yet, you made it so accessible to a Western audience. And he said, well, as a writer, what I tell myself is not my duty to explain, it is my duty to explore. And I use that with all my authors now. It doesn't matter if they're writing about diverse characters or not. I think that's just a very great way to frame your writing when you're sitting down and doing it. You know, it's not about trying to explain your experience to people. It's trying to explore a character, explore a situation, and give your reader a lot more credit, at least in the first draft. And then in the second draft, you can go in and add stuff. But just to reiterate the need to have more Muslim voices, I certainly have seen a lot of and read a lot of those books that are by Muslims where the character sort of assimilation seems to be the path to enlightenment. And as someone who's, I grew up in this country, I'm absolutely an American, that still bothers me, like as if the Western experience is sort of the ideal. That is so wrong-headed, and I think that we need to show people ways that, all the ways that that's not true. And sharing stories, I think, is a great way to get people to understand and perhaps even empathize. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. Like, I could talk about this all day, for real. You guys are wonderful.
We thank you all so much for your presence. Okay. So I do have another question, actually, Zareen. It's definitely for you. What do you think about self-publishing? I know that you are an editor. Like, I know that a lot of people...
I think that self-publishing is really interesting, and it certainly had a big impact on the industry. I don't know a lot about the nuts and bolts of it, and I'm absolutely amazed at the number of people who have been able to be very successful at it when, as someone who works at what would be considered, I guess, traditional publishing, there are so many books published. It is so hard to get the attention of readers when you have so many different distractions in their faces. So the idea that someone who, on their own steam, is able to get people's attention is kind of amazing. I will say there's something interesting about, I read this fact that predominantly the biggest genre in self-published books is memoir, which I'm like, oh, that's really interesting, because I think a lot of people want to tell their own story. And, if you don't have to run it by a publisher, and in some cases, even after you do, you're not necessarily bound to fact-checking. Certainly, there are a lot of big names that have been caught up in that. I think giving people an opportunity to share their story is a positive thing. In terms of what it's doing to the industry, I kind of have to wait and see. It had an impact in for a while in certain genres. I think romance actually, it changed the game for a while in romance, and a lot more people started writing. I'm certainly not a snob about the kinds of books people write and the kinds of books people want to read. We're all complicated human beings with a lot of different interests. You don't have to only read high art. You don't have to only engage with things that are intellectual. I'm just a fan of anything that gets people reading in general. But, in terms of the self-publishing books moving into traditional publishing, I think in some cases it makes sense, and in most cases it doesn't.
I just want to add this. What people don't realize that self-publishing can be very expensive. And they think that, okay, if they do it themselves, they're going to make more money. Actually, in the beginning, unless your book goes big, you're spending a lot of money publishing that book, advertising that book, distributing that book. I'm pro traditional publishing, maybe because I'm, again, old school, because I love having editors. I adore my editors. I think everyone needs an editor. So, and you get a free editor when you have traditional publishing, and everything is pretty much, there is assistance on distribution, in publication and marketing, and that's important for especially first-time writers. So, I mean, the publishing industry is doing better than it was in 2008, right, Zareen?
Yes, that's true. Certainly with kids publishing, it's doing a lot better.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, also, do you recommend the self-publishing route for first books? I know that people are not necessarily doing it as often, but should they definitely try the old school route and go to a publishing company instead?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the situation. Like I said, I don't know a lot of the nuts and bolts of it. I can speak as someone who has been submitted projects that were previously self-published. The way that it can be a negative is that it's almost like you're market testing your book. And certainly when I bring it to my acquisitions group, what they'll ask me is like, okay, well, when it was $1.99, how many people bought it? you know, and if it's a low number, if it's only like tens of thousands, then they're going to be less interested. It can be a risk in that way. But if you, and also even if you've ended up selling like 100,000 copies, how many of them were 99 cents? How many of them were free? It's, you know, you can kind of game the system in that way so that you can have this proposal that you send into publishers and say, like, you know, do you want to take on my book? It sold this many copies, or you know, was downloaded this many times. I think publishers have now had the experience where they were very excited and took it on and said, like, oh, this is an indication that this author has a wide readership, and then it didn't pan out when the book was actually published traditionally, that more people bought it. It sort of had found its audience online, and it did not attract any new readers. And they had already bought it for 99 cents, so they weren't willing to pay $16.99 for hardcover. So I think it's a risk. I think it also requires a lot of research into the category you're publishing into. Certain categories seem to thrive in self-publishing more than others. And I think it's also sometimes an experiment. Certainly I've heard of nonfiction, shorter, almost like features, being downloadable novellas, almost novella size. They're nonfiction, but they're basically feature articles that weren't published in traditional magazines that are now available to download on Amazon, you know, that you can buy. So I think the way that people consume stories is changing, and we kind of have to, as an industry, or as anyone interested in that, kind of has to stay aware of it and not, you know, I personally love reading physical books. They're my preference, and I know that you can have print on demand and self-publishing as well. But I do think the next generation of kids has a different relationship to technology, and a different relationship to what would be considered, I guess, gatekeepers and curators. I don't think that they really care about the publisher in a way that people in the past used to. So yeah, I'm open-minded about it, so I wouldn't say don't do it, but be aware of some of the, if you want to move into traditional publishing, some of the problems you might have. But I should really run, unfortunately.
Well, thank you so much for staying extra. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great talking to you guys.
No problem. Well, ladies, it's been a wonderful, insightful, and enlightening conversation, but I'm afraid that's all the time we have for right now. On behalf of Muslimah Montage and AltMuslimah and our director, producer, Sabina Khan-Ibarra, I'd like to thank today's guests for joining us, Fariba Nawa, Doreen Joffrey, and Salima Ghafoor. Again, we thank you all so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. I hope that we can have you back on our show again soon. And for all of our visitors and viewers at home, thank you for watching and for your questions and comments. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. You can check the description for more information about our guests and our Muslimah Montage and AltMuslimah. I'm your host, Naisha Malika B. Austin. We hope to see you next time, inshallah. Until then, be blessed.
Thank you.